some. Remember, who were the some in Galatians? The some who came down from James. The some from James who came down to Antioch from Jerusalem. And what happened after they came down? The people like Barnabas and Peter stopped keeping fellowship with Paul and stopped keeping table fellowship on the issue of purity with people who were not keeping purity regulations. And Paul gets very worked up about that. How many are familiar, remember what we read? Don't you remember that, Galatians 2? If you're a Christian, you certainly will remember that. If you're not a Christian, you can read it again. It's in Galatians 2. These are called the some from James. And later on they're called those of the circumcision, or supposedly preaching the circumcision, or something to do with the circumcision. He calls them like it. Well, I'll read it to you again since you look so completely blank on the subject. It pains me to feel, as Paul says, that I'm wasting my time with you. Not really, but you see, when I went, according to chapter 2 of Galatians, to 14 years after I left Palestine, to lay before the gospel which I preach among the non-Jews, the peoples, the Gentiles, but privately, because not, in other words, he wasn't called, he just went up there. To those that were reckoned to be something, those the thought of repute, those thought to be important, meaning the leadership of James, as he later calls them, the pillars, James the brother, John and Peter, for fear that somehow the course I had been running would be run in vain. In other words, he hasn't yet gotten, in these 14 years, an official sanction for the course that he had been working on, or the gospel that he was teaching. He makes that very clear. And he makes it clear that Titus, that circumcision was a big thing, because he says they wanted even Titus to be circumcised, but so they could enslave us. So the issue of circumcision was related to the slavery issue. But I would not retreat even for an hour on the truth of the gospel as I teach it, basically. And I didn't care of those those people thought to be something. You see how careful he is when he refers to people? It's like, you talk about me someplace, you know that professor I have who thinks he's a big shot. You know, you don't want to get in trouble for having mentioned the name, so you say, oh, you know, there's big shots over there, or those people think they're hot stuff, or those people think they're something, but to me they're nothing. Well, he says that here. Those who were thought to be something, whatever they were, to me makes no difference, because then he makes a little bit of a comment. God does not accept the person of man, so I don't really care what they think they are. People think those important men. It's not the Jews here, it's within the church. For those considered important, those of repute, had nothing to add to me. These big shots, later he calls them pillars. On the contrary, they agreed that I was to go to the circumcised, uncircumcised, and they to the circumcised. We read this before. And these pillars, James, Cephas, and John, gave the right hand of fellowship and said they would go to the circumcision and we would go to the Gentiles. So there's a division of labor there where he was instructed not to take his presentation to circumcised people, because it just would upset them, as we've seen it does. Only that we should remember the poor. That's his view of things, whether we think that's the whole picture, because later on it turns out that there's some problem with this, because the James people don't seem to get the message. As he's presenting, he thinks that this is really clearly. It's like making a deal with maybe Yasser Arafat or somebody, or Abu Abbas, and they get the different picture than what you may have gotten from what the deal was. Anyway, when Peter came to Antioch, I set my face against him, because he was greatly to be blamed. Peter is not such a good chap here. Because when the sum from James came down, there the sum. It's line 212. Because before the sum from James came down, that is to Antioch, he was eating with the non-Jewish people, not worrying about dietary things. But when they came down, he was afraid of the party of the circumcision and separated himself. And the other Jews, that is within the movement, also acted the hypocrite and played the hypocrite with him and were carried away by this hypocrisy. So Paul is very angry at this. Anyone disagree with that? Anyone see that anyone disagree that there's a problem here? Anyone think these people are all on the same wavelength? And primary sources take precedent over secondary sources. Do I think this is the truth? Well, from Paul's perspective, I do believe it is the truth. So you say, well, what are you talking about? Well, first of all, in this gospel, he says, the Galatians, that he doesn't have letters of recommendation. Now, let's look at, for instance, just quickly, 1 Corinthians and Romans, how he introduces himself. 1 Corinthians, Paul, called by God's will to be an apostle of Jesus Christ. Not any church or anything that appointed him. Romans, see how he does. I mean, I don't remember all these introductions, but I'm just giving you an example. He is quite careful. He's a careful person. Paul, called an apostle, a bond slave of Jesus Christ, who was separated to the gospel of God. The gospel about his son, who came of the seed of David. All right, basically doctrinaire, but nothing about his appointment or his appointment letters. And Galatians is the most clear. Galatians, this is my way of pulling of some of the things from the letters in here. I said I was going to talk about the appointment letters. Okay, let's go back to 2 Corinthians. What does he say at the beginning of that one? Anything? Nothing. Paul, an apostle by God's will. Do we need to recommend ourselves? Or like some, do we need letters of recommendation? Well, I think we now know who the some are. The some are always just about from James, the leadership. But he doesn't want to say that. Like you don't want to say anything nasty about me or the head of your church or your family or the head of your department or your business, so you say, oh, some, you know, or some of those people. But we know who you're talking about. Does anyone feel that it's wrong completely, that this may not be the case? Maybe that, I mean, I'm not saying it's completely proved. All I'm saying is that it looks like the same sum in the Galatians, okay? I'm not saying that's proved. But we do find out that these some care about the law, because that's the very next thing. Because he's going to compare the letters of recommendation to the letters of the Torah and say that he doesn't care about letters of the Torah written on stone. He only cares about letters written on your heart. That